begin with, first of all, congratulations on the film.
Thank you.
Which everyone here has just seen this evening, and I'm assuming enjoyed it?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Although, as I was saying to you earlier, I'm not sure if enjoy is exactly the right word with a film like this. It's so kind of powerful. My first question really is, how did you get involved with this project? Well, how did it begin for you?
It started in 2008, and I was invited to the screening of a film called Hunger, which, if you haven't seen, I would really encourage everyone to go take a look at it. It was made by the director, Steve McQueen, and at that time, the film had just come out. Very few people had seen it, but we share agents, and I saw the film and was just absolutely blown away by every aspect of it. And similarly, Steve had read a manuscript I'd just written, and he was very enthralled by the writing. We sat down, we had breakfast, and in that breakfast, he was very effusive about wanting to tackle this area of American history. And we didn't have an exact story at that point, but there were elements of it, of coming into the story, about how we could explore it, about why we should explore it, that we both thought were very interesting and relevant and challenging and worth taking on that challenge. And I went back and started researching various topics and would present Steve with various ideas, and he had thoughts, but we certainly, there was nothing that we landed on that felt right or felt that it could carry the story in the way that either he or I really wanted to. His wife, interestingly, is an historian, and she found this book that I had never heard of. I did not know it. I was not aware of it. He had read it. He thought it was terrific. I read it. I felt similarly, and that was the beginning of this journey. The first time that I read the memoir, and it is out and it's in public domain, and I would really encourage everyone to take a look at it, because it is probably, honestly, one of the most singular documents that I've ever had the opportunity to read. And it translated so well to film, but there are so many other elements of Solomon's story, of other people that he met, of the totality of his 12 years, and the way that he writes, his language, his elevated nature, his character, that were so powerful that I certainly felt of a like mind with the director, that this was a story that deserved to be told and needed to be told.
So finding that manuscript, finding that his story, Solomon's story, that was kind of really the spark that gave you the project you were looking to do together.
Yes, there's certainly any number of histories. You think about this, that slavery as an indoctrinated institution in America lasted over 160 years. You're talking about something that involved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals who were caught up in it. So there are many histories that could have been told, but within that narrative, as in the film, to be able to read and write for a person of color at that time in the South was a death sentence. So relatively speaking, there were very few first-person narratives, and this was a very unique one in that. So, obviously to tell one story, there are millions that we could have told, but within those choices that we could have made, and within those first-person narratives, this was one that we both felt was extraordinary. And that certainly was the jumping-off point to let's go and try to build out that narrative in a film fashion.
Right. So at the point where you started creating the screenplay, the script, this wasn't a done deal. There wasn't already a studio involved saying
no.
So it was a spec.
This was a spec script. That was the very interesting thing about it. Now, Plan B was involved. Plan B, in some ways, maintained the relationship between Steve and I. They were aware of his work. They knew my work. They really thought that together we could perhaps find something. But it was a unique circumstance in that it wasn't as if we were going with the studio and they'd written me a check, and I knew there was a real probability, because there was skin in the game, no pun intended, that there was a chance they would go off and make this. But also along that line, what was very nice about it was I had more ownership over the material than I would have had in another circumstance. So I certainly had to go out and write a script that people would want then to go off and make, but I had more of a sense of, here's an opportunity to write a script that I really want to write. And it's not just, well, these folks paid me, and obviously I've got to please them. It was more, what's the script I want to write? I hope that I can please folks with it, but I have an opportunity to say the things that I want to do, build a script that I want to build, and then turn it into these individuals and see if I can get them on board.
Okay. Was it, Did you know before you started this project? I mean, you mentioned you'd watched Hunger, but you didn't have a relationship per se with Steve before Hunger. So, and at that time he'd only had the one film. So did you, when you were writing the screenplay, have a sense of what a kind of visual director he was?
Yes and no. Hunger is it is such a fully realized film. And the language that he uses, and also Sean Bobbitt and Joe Walker, his longtime director of photography and editor, they have really worked together to create their own language of cinema. So when I sat down, I certainly, like anyone who sees that film, saw a lot of possibilities when you spend time talking to him, and I had, beyond that, an opportunity to get to know Sean and Joe. It was very easy to understand at that point how they approached film and how they approached storytelling. But it was interesting because in that space, from the time that I met them, they went off and subsequent to that made the film Shame, and you could just feel this interesting groundswell around them and what they did and how they told stories. And that was very interesting because I think at that point we were far enough down the road with the script for this film that it didn't really alter that, but you could see other people coming to it and see other people on the outside going, oh my God, who are these folks? And to be a part of that at that point and to know that we were going to be next, it was very gratifying. And also, at some point, it becomes daunting because at that point, people have expectations. Even though a lot of people did not see that film, the people who saw those two films had a lot of expectations for what was going to be next. So you get to that tipping point from that sort of excitement of, oh wow, look, I bought low and I can sell high, to, oh my God, what is this stock really worth? You know, are there fundamentals underneath all of this? And certainly with those individuals and all of the people who were involved in this film, there were great fundamentals involved.
Right. And what about, again, we talk a lot about, expectations, but particularly with the subject matter, did you feel a certain burden of responsibility to it, or certainly weight of expectation with a project of this nature, addressing, this isn't a cop movie, this is a movie about, American history? Did that in any way, create any difficulties or challenges for you as a writer, that kind of weight of responsibility?
Not in terms of weight, and it's interesting you talk about a cop movie because in some ways, there's so many cop films, and I worked on a cop show for 4 or 5 years, and how do you do it differently? How do you do it in a way that is going to break through the fantastic films going back to Sidney Lumet and William Friedkin, that is going to be different or better or more unusual? When we started thinking about this, there just were so few examples of this kind of film. It was more that we weren't just thinking about American history, we were thinking about all of these really powerful films about human dynamic over the course of cinema and how do we fit in there. But for me, it was always going back to that source material. It was so strong and it was so evocative that if I could squeeze the emotional velocity that Solomon had into a 2-hour and 15-minute space, then things were going to take care of themselves. There was an emotional honesty, there was a historical accuracy that I wanted to nail, but it was never that sense of, oh my God, nobody's ever done this before, so I've got to do it in a unique way. It was, wow, no one has ever done this before. If we tried to be honest about what we're doing, I think that honesty was going to carry through, and I believe it has.
Okay, yeah, fair point. What was, like any book that gets adapted, I'm guessing that Solomon's autobiography was not perfectly laid out in screenplay structure. So what were in those kind of technical terms, what were the challenges as a writer for you in taking what you read and turning it into, a vehicle that can be made into a movie?
A really good question, because the structure in and of itself was not even something that I think that most readers would have an expectation of in 2013. Even extremely personal narratives at this point, we have an expectation of execution and how it should flow, and the reality that when a writer works with editors now, and even the most fantastic first-person narratives have probably been through a very specific editing process, and just those expectations for an audience are elevated. And Solomon wrote in a way that on one hand was very beautiful, was very natural, was very experiential, but in some ways was kind of a 12-year sprawl, and he would start in one place and jump back to another. Now it's interesting because you go back to the film and there are those moments where the narrative moves around and jumps a little bit, But coming into it, even though we had conversations about potentially being deconstructive, ultimately, for me, it was, does the narrative work at all in a linear fashion? If you go into it, do you understand what's happening? Can you follow it? Can you track those emotions? Rather than, let me sit down and try to be really tricky with people and flow this way and that way. Again, one of the things that was very fortunate for me was being able to spend time with the editor, Joe Walker, a little bit. And there was nothing, I think, in those conversations where we had to talk about, well, let's do this and let's do that. But being able to see his other work, outside of Hunger, be able to get to know him as a person and get to just an idea of how he worked, that certainly was helpful for me in that sense of, if I can nail this as a story, these gentlemen, these other individuals can go back and figure out when you're in the edit, where may these things lie? Where can we take them and move them? But I think one of the reasons that you can do that with a film like this, you look at the individual scenes, those moments, they're so well constructed in the cinematography, in the performances, just as scenes in and of themselves. Many of them you can lift and you can move around. Some of them, obviously, they're tied to the narrative and it just wouldn't work to move. But in those ones that are a little time out of line, those scenes, what they did with it, outside of my work, was just so strong. It's so powerful. They do work as just individual slices that then allows you to move them here or there if the story, in their sense, in their mindset, if they feel that works, it definitely works.
Was the initial screenplay long? Because it feels like a film that you'd have to cut and cut and cut to get to a running time.
It was funny because in starting, we've been very fortunate. We've been out now since October, and people are still interested in the film and talking about it. And I remember at one of these early Q&As, someone asked me how long the script was. And at this point in my career, I like to feel like a responsible individual, and because it was a spec script, and I know that, again, I had the freedom to do a lot of things, but I knew I had to turn in a script that people would look at and go, yes, we could probably shoot this, and I knew what the budget would approximately be. So someone asked me early on, where did the script come in? And I just, being Mr. Responsible, I said, well, I know the script probably was a little long, but it was about maybe 130 pages. And for whatever reason, I'd saved a bunch of emails on my computer and they disappeared, and for some reason they popped up again. And I started going through them, and I found the first email that I'd sent to the director when I turned in the script, and I said, oh, here's the script. It's a little bit long. It's about 157 pages, but we'll work it back from there. So it was long, but a lot of that length for me, going back to that script, was just in the description of things that had happened or why they happened, or talking about the Virginia reel, or talking about where violin strings came from. You don't just go to Guitar Center in 1841 and get violin strings. So you never know where people are going to come into a script. You never know how much time they're going to have, what their viewpoint is going to be, what their background is going to be. And I wanted to write something more than just the words on the page that was really going to be a Bible for individuals. So in that first pass, there were just, going back to it, the first 3 pages of the script were spent on how you make violin strings in the 1840s. Right. And it was 3 pages, but I needed people to understand that out of a difficult process, something very beautiful occurs. And that life is very different. I mean, yeah, anybody would sit there and go, yeah, okay, life was different in 1841, but where do you really get violin? Violin strings are obviously very important to this story, but for anyone to come into it, I didn't want to be preachy or, oh, look how much I know, but, have you thought about that? What that process would be. And if people read that and take something away from it and go, oh, everything needs to be a little bit slower, everything needs to be more thoughtful, I thought that would be helpful. Yeah. And some of that had to fall away before we obviously went to the financiers with an overlong script, but things did survive. And again, for me as a writer, it's more than just, oh, here's your dialogue, goodbye. Here's some context. For me, 3.5, 4 years, here are things that I took away. And I certainly feel like there were other people who took that and built and built and built and built something that was far richer, deeper than I could ever imagine. But part of that, I hope, was because of things that I did imagine and added into the script itself.
So that's talking about adding things in. Let's talk about taking away. How comfortable were you diverting and omitting from Solomon's original autobiography? I'm assuming there were things that just had to go.
Yeah.
And how comfortable were you with doing that, and what was your thought process in what to keep and what to lose?
That is a very good question, and you posed it in a good way. And I have to be honest, I was not, I certainly wasn't comfortable taking things away, because you realize that, in particular, many of the things that were dropping away were other characters, other human beings, and this is a true story. So when you're losing these characters, when you're losing these moments, you're losing real lives, people who survive very difficult circumstances, or at the very least lived through. Some people clearly did not survive them the way Solomon was able to return to his life. And this, you know what people had to go through to survive this. And to remove that, to take it away, maybe one last chance in history for these people to be acknowledged, that was difficult. But there's a reality. You cannot make a 12-year film. I think everyone did an amazing job to put this into about 2 hours and 15 minutes and have an amazing flow to it, an amazing move through it. So there were things that we had to take away. That was just a reality. The one thing, though, that I was very, very keen about was not being additive and not looking at this film through the mindset of, when I started in 2008, of a black man in 2008, and Solomon should have done this, and I wish he'd done that. And there were moments early on where it was like, you know what? If I'm watching this film right now, I want Solomon to do this, or I want this to happen. And that was something that I really pushed myself out of.
You were never tempted to kind of gild the lily a bit and think, this would be just so much more effective if he'd only said this, so I'm going to have him say this.
Well, why doesn't he try to escape more? Or, why didn't he say this to somebody else? And there were moments in the early going, and I think for me, having worked in the studio system for a long time, where you can kind of anticipate a note. Where someone is going to say, he's the hero, he should do this.
Make him more dynamic.
Make him more proactive. Or, the narrative would work better if it was less experiential and had more drive to it. But there were moments, and again, a lot of the people that we're working with, and certainly Plan B, they were never a group of individuals who sat around like a studio saying, well, we need you to do this if we're going to go sell it. So for me, that was the other big thing. That wasn't so hard. It was just something I had to get myself out of. Was this was his story. This he wrote. And yes, this may have to drop out, and these characters may have to become one character, and instead of spending time at this plantation, it's just going to be these 2 or 3 as opposed to the 4 or 5 that he was actually consigned to. But it was, I never felt that pressure to, you got to make it more movie-ish. You got to have more of a traditional narrative, a conventional narrative, and that for me was great. In the end, when it really could be an experiential film and try to take an audience and drop them into these moments and let the audience sit there for a while and come out of it with their own experiences, that was phenomenal.
So how do you make sure there's a consistent author's voice? Because there will be moments in that film that are lifted almost verbatim from his autobiography, and then there'll be moments that will be 100% your words, because they'll need to be. Yeah. And how do you make sure that for the audience, and just for the project's sort of integrity, that there's no, kind of slip between those two? How do you make that tone consistent? That's a writer.
You try really hard. Honestly, it was, I read the memoir for the first time, and you're blown away. You're blown away by the writing. You're blown away by the. Honestly, you read it and you think, well, this must have been made up. But there were court cases. There was documentation. Things that support the fact that this really happened. And then you go back and you start thinking about, okay, now how do I actually manage this? The language, the elevated language, the eloquent nature with which he spoke and wrote. The way that he would talk about things that were completely off screen. It is a very beautiful film, even though it is very stark in places. But Solomon talked about the beauty of the area that he was around, the geography. So it was very difficult because, yes, as you say, there were moments where you could take dialogue wholesale and, fine, we'll just put this there. Maybe we have to cut a little bit of it, but that's going to go there. That's fine. There are other places where he would describe things, maybe not so much dialogue, but, okay, I can kind of match that up. I know where I'm going. There are other places like that scene with Alfred Woodard, the Mistress Shaw scene. That was just a line in the book. That was just a line, but it was such a powerful moment in what he was saying and that concept of that one day a week where these individuals would have off and what they would do and what they would talk about. That was a scene for me in particular where, after, it was 3.5 years of work on this, but if it didn't match what else was going on, it would have been so easy for people to look at that and go, well, that's 2008. That's anachronistic, it's incorrect, it doesn't fit everything else. So I mean it sincerely. It was just a lot of working and rewriting and researching and finding other documents of that era and trying to get to a point where I could really feel like in those places where I'm now really walking away from that narrative, can I do it and put it up there and make it absolutely seamless, absolutely seamless.
Now, when we watch the film, there are a number of times where the director chooses to focus on I don't know how to put this simply. Sometimes he'll focus on a detail rather than a reaction, where we are as an audience, to take an example, there's a moment in the film that in any screenplay you'd be the kind of all is lost moment, where kind of, he's written the letter, he's been betrayed, he burns the letter. Now, in nearly any Hollywood film, as he burns the letter, the script would say, tie on Solomon, and we'd see his quivering, we'd see his kind of broken, all hope is lost. But instead, in this film, we watch the embers of the paper burn. We see it all, and it's very poetic, and it's beautiful. But how often did you see scenes that kind of you may have written one way, and then when you saw them, how they were executed, it's like, wow, that is not how I expected that to look? Or
I would say almost every single scene in the film, and I mean that in a very good way. People sometimes they'll look at a script and they'll say to the writer, I saw your script and they changed a lot. And for me as a screenwriter, I think you want people to change. You don't want to go and see the script exactly the way it was rendered and put that up on screen. You want that depth of storytelling and see the moments that the actors find, things that I could have sat forever and not have thought of, things that Sean, the DP, found that there's no way I could have thought of, things that the editor found. And there are any number of moments like that, up and down, where you just go, oh, that's absolutely beautiful. And there's certainly moments in the screenplay where I may have indicated this or that. I tried to not be didactic with, okay, let's make sure we cut and land on Solomon's face here. But again, I think that was just a benefit of spending time with so many people who were involved in the film and not feeling like I needed to, I wanted to, I had to try to dictate what was going on. But also, this was a very unique experience. And there's some times where you feel like you want to indicate a little bit more with this script. May I suggest you might want to do that? I never had that feeling. And I think, again, there was so much communication going on that I could concentrate on the things that were important to me, whether they may not have been important to other people later on. But ultimately, because of that communication, people saw what I was hoping to do, and then could either take that and build off of it. But I have to be honest with you, in terms of their respect for the dialogue, for things that were going on, the respect was there where it needed to be, and the divergence was there where it deserved to be.
Okay. There's inevitably a thrill for any writer, however experienced, when you see what you've created on the page turned into actual motion picture images, and it's a fantastic alchemy from page to screen. Is there anything, I'm just curious, when you saw the film for the first time, was there any specific moment or scene or that particularly blew you away? Went, wow, to go from this to that, was there any?
And again, I mean this sincerely. I could go through almost the entire film. Big things, small things that weren't in the script. The moment where Lupita's character is making the little husk dolls, that was not in the script. And I've had the opportunity to hear where she got that from and where it came from. And it was really, there's a beautiful connectivity of things that she saw, that she wanted to explore, that then they found, that not only did they find it, but then the way they chose to shoot it. I've had the opportunity to see it fully with audiences now about 4 or 5 times, which is different than seeing it alone or seeing it in parts. And there are, on the first time you see it, of course, it's all about the words. It's all about the words. Then, the second time you see it, you move away from that, and it's all about this or that. And even now, there's a moment in a scene where something happens that someone has told me about that I've never caught, and I have not yet. I don't want to go and just pop in a screener and go, okay, where's that thing that I didn't see? I want to see it with an audience and get that moment. But the fact that, people, the big thing now is 3D filming. 3D, everything's got to be 3D. There's so many dimensions in this film and so many things that were added. And just even being down on the set when they talk about how they did the cotton And it's one thing, I was shooting a film in England, and I wasn't able to, I was only on the set for a couple of days. And so they went through how we did the cotton and all that, and it was like, oh, okay, that sounds good. I can't wait to see that. And then you see it, and you're like, wow, Jesus, it was not CGI. And the fact that you did not do that CGI and how you chose to do it, and also how it put people in the mindset. When a crew goes out, and these are the hardest working folks in show business, in Louisiana, in the middle of summer, and plant the cotton that they're going to plant for the film. And everybody comes back and goes, Jesus Christ, we were worn out from a day of that. We can only imagine what days on end with no end in sight was like. There's a value in that, to doing things in a real manner and understanding that and coming back from that and having everybody on the crew invested in that. So when I see the film, again and again and again, I could tell you a scene today, and there's certainly scenes that you would expect that I would think are amazing. There are other scenes that are just small and minor that I go, oh, that's interesting. They did it that way. But not trying to be disingenuous or dodgy. Almost every scene is just, it blows me away.
That's great. What 12 Years a Slave is very much in what they call the award space now, which is, I'm guessing a pretty nice experience. How are you finding that? Just the experience of this film that's, taken on a life beyond its theatricals. It's being talked about. It's going to be talked about for many months to come. Some are saying it's a front runner. I mean, just in general terms, how, as a writer, what's that experience like?
It's very, it's odd. I mean, at first, obviously, it's very gratifying because, when I came out here 20 years ago, and you sit in the coffee shop I used to go to on Beverly Boulevard, and you sit and you think, oh, one day I'm going to write this script, and everybody's going to, have a connection with it, and it's going to have a cultural density. And then you write enough, and you enjoy it for what it is, and you're appreciative that you get one made, and then it's two, and then it's four, and those were all good movies, and they're fine, and they registered right about here. And this comes along, and it's unusual because, again, when you read what Solomon wrote, you read what he went through, it becomes less about you. And I think had it been a different script in a different place, in a different time, and I'd approach it in a different way, I would feel very different. But I think about what he went through to be able to honestly, to tell this story. What I did doesn't really compare.
I get that. Now, you touched on it earlier, but you said that you weren't on set for very much at the time because you were making a film yourself, which is All Is By My Side, the Jimi Hendrix thing. Now, we'll get onto that in a minute, but what astonished me is I read somewhere, maybe it's, that you were directing a feature in Europe, and at the same time you were doing rewrites in the evening on 12 Years a Slave and sending... I mean, I can't quite comprehend how you could have your head in those two different headspaces simultaneously, given that both are very all-in endeavors.
Well, that's the other thing when you're sitting around in the coffee shop 20 years ago and you're hoping, gosh, I hope I can, get one movie made. And then there comes a point where you're involved with two really unique projects, working with some truly amazing individuals. They're shooting simultaneously. One we shot in Dublin, the other one was shooting Louisiana, and you would spend your days, getting everything ready, prepping, being in your mindset, working with the actors and all that, and you'd come back home, and obviously because of the time difference, and you're starting to get phone calls of, and again, and to Plan B's credit and everybody's credit, they wanted to know what I thought, about, we need the script change, what do you think, how should we approach it, what would you like to do, and by the way, can you get it to us tomorrow? And it was actually a really, really wonderful thing because you can get vapor lock on a project, and it can just be so all-consuming and, all about these problems. You can't see the forest through the trees, and you have these other people elsewhere who are going through similar issues on a different project, and they want to know what you think. And you can set everything else aside for a minute and go, okay, it's a little bit of go time now. And what would I do, and how can I approach that? And one I was directing, one I'd written and directed, and the other one I was strictly the writer. So it was nice. Let me go back and write for a minute. Let me be the writer. How would a writer go after this? And then you wake up in the morning and go, okay, I'm done with writing. Now let me go work on this as a director. It was, it has been a very, I've been, 2013 was an amazing year, and I was very blessed. And I never looked at any of this as a burden or a problem or, God, I wish this would stop. It was, this is a moment that myself and a lot of people that have chosen to be with me and be in my life have worked towards. And I just enjoyed every moment of it. And again, I could not have done it without the cast that I had, the crew that I had, and people who were willing to work all day, every day to put me in a place where I could concentrate on either or. And people knew that I had this other thing going on. They're amazingly supportive. And okay, we've got your day worked out. You go worry about your night, and then come in tomorrow as fresh as you can be, and let's work on that.
Wow. Looking back at your career, I mean, I don't know how many of the audience are aware of this, but you have written, you've written novels, you've written graphic novels, you've worked on sitcoms, you've worked on hour-long dramas, you've done animated shows, you've directed features, written features. It seems like a remarkably diverse body of work as much as anything else.
Yeah.
How did you end up doing so many different types of work?
Honestly, I love to write. I love to write, and I love to be writing. And I whether it's a trait or a disease, I don't feel correct if I'm not writing. And before we were talking, I was sitting over here writing. I was, writing on the way over. I'm going to go home. And so for me, I mean, let's say it's hard for anyone in entertainment. It's hard for anyone. And if you're an other, it becomes exponentially more difficult. And I was never gonna just, gosh, I hope one day somebody allows me to do this. Somebody told me a long time ago, I wish I had thought of this line, I did not, is that, you don't need Hollywood's permission to go off and do something. And so for me, it was, I'll write a spec script. I don't care. I'll write this. When I came out here 20 years ago, I was doing other things. And the first opportunity I had, I'd written a novel, and it was still sort of kicking around, but I had an opportunity to write sitcoms. And it was the things that I would learn working on a sitcom set and working with 12 other writers in a room, and the first time you get to work with actors and all of those kinds of things, that was a learning experience. And you take that and then you start moving into drama, and you start learning those things. I got to work with this guy, I say this guy, I hope most of you know him, John Wells, who did ER and did West Wing and Third Watch and all these amazing shows, and to be able to work with an individual like that and learn those kinds of things. And they're all things that I put in my pocket and just learned, and everything to me was an opportunity. And it wasn't, why would I do a sitcom or, a graphic novel. I grew up reading graphic novels. I remember when I met John Singleton early on, he said, man, graphic novels, all you're doing is working with storyboards. And I go, oh, that's storyboarding. So working in that space and working in that environment, and you do that for a while, and after a while, it's not, this job or that job, it's a career and it's a resume, and all these things that I learned. And over again this last year where I had an opportunity to really go out on my own and do these things and execute in a space with individuals like Plan B, where they say, okay, we could get this made, but this is our budget and we got to hit it, and how to make that script play and work. Aside from it being a little bit too long coming in. But making that thing work and making it play, and then going off and being able to do my thing and know how to communicate with actors and know how to work with a crew and knowing yourself and what you want to do. That's how you end up doing all those kinds of things. But it starts with, I love to write, and if I got a space to do it, I'll do it. I will.
Okay. We'll open up to the audience in a second. I've just got two last questions.
Sure.
First one is, can you tell us a little bit about the feature that you just filmed in 2013?
Yeah, it's a film that's called All Is By My Side. It's about a very particular year in the life of Jimi Hendrix. And it stars Andre Benjamin as Jimi Hendrix, Imogen Poots is in it, Haley Atwell, really terrific cast from the UK. And we really wanted to, rather than do a sort of, old school is kind of a sprawling cradle to grave kind of story, but to really hone in on one transformative life and a year that I think most people are completely unaware of, the fact that he did go to England, the fact that at 24 years old, this guy was kind of washed up. He played with Ike and Tina Turner and the Isley Brothers and didn't fit in because he was such a unique and original artist. And he was working as a backup artist in a kind of mediocre group in New York, and a young girl, 19 years old, by the name of Linda Keith, who at that time was Keith Richards' girlfriend, 19, walked in and saw him playing and said, this is the most amazing guitarist I'd ever seen. And made it her personal mission to put this guy on the map. And 1 year in London went from literally leaving, working under the name Jimmy James, to coming back as the Jimi Hendrix that we think that we know, with all the iconography of the hair and the look and the style, but also why. You know, why did he look that way? Why was he dressing that way? What happened in that year? And what were those key relationships with him, with Linda, with Chaz Chandler, with Kathy Etchingham? You know, for me, a film, if it's going to be at all relevant, it's got to be informative. And I think there are a lot of people who walk into this film going, oh, you know, oh, yeah, Jimi Hendrix, yeah, we know it, we get it. Again, what they did, what Andre did, is absolutely phenomenal. And you know, you asked me before about these things that happen simultaneously. So, you know, we were filming those films at the same time. They both opened at Toronto, the Toronto Film Festival, on the same weekend. And the response to both films, it has been an honor and a pleasure being part of 12 Years a Slave. But on the same time, to be able to do your own thing and to have an equal, you know, certainly we're still under the radar a little bit. We're coming out in May here in the States. But the response to that film has just been phenomenal to this point. It really has been. So it's been great.
Last question I'll open up. I also believe that you were working on LA Riots.
Yeah, that's interesting because that is a script that I had originally written in about 2007 that Spike Lee was going to direct. And that was a script that really changed my life. It changed my life. It was actually a Blacklist script back in the day. And I got to tell you, that really, and this was in 2007, it was really starting the point where that, you know, that was making a difference in people's lives. But it was one of those scripts that, and I mean this sincerely aside from my involvement in it, certainly a script about LA, about a seminal time that, you know, like 12 Years a Slave, you know, no one, you know, to that time and even up to it, that it was the largest social uprising since the draft riots in the 1860s, I'm sorry, in terms of loss of life, in terms of property damage, in terms of why, in terms of the systemic failures that had to happen and could only happen here in Los Angeles to allow that to happen. So that's been sort of in and out of development. It's back on now, and the timing couldn't be more perfect in every regard. And now Justin Lin is on as the director. And actually, that's what I was finishing up as I was sitting back there. I got to get that script in. But it has been a very interesting journey with that. And that was a script because of the protection that I had as a writer and the level that I was working at. You know, that was the script that got me Red Tails, and those two things got me, you know, 12 Years a Slave, and that then came into All Is by My Side. So there's just been this, you know, this quiet growth over the last few years. I just sort of changed direction with my life and said, what are the things that I would do, not necessarily for money, but because I feel very connected to that story matter. And it's just very ironic that that script that I wrote at that time that never quite got made, that ended up on the Blacklist, that people just talked about and talked about. Jeremy Kleiner at Plan B had read that script, and that was part of the reason that he wanted me to sit down with Steve McQueen, was that this thing, if you can do this again, this is what we would like you to do. So I'm very excited for that and for the future, but what happened with that and what I was able to do and how it was recognized early on made a huge difference, and part of the reason I'm sitting here right now.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. Let's see if we've got any questions from the audience. Yes.
I had a question about the process of finding the voices for characters in different social strata.
Yeah.
You know, there was such a range of how people spoke, and it was so unexpected, and I felt so accurate. And was there a lot of research that went into that, or was it intuitive?
Well, thank you. I mean, some of it, again, certainly with Solomon's voice, and that was very clear coming through in the book, and some of the other characters as well. And you have this socioeconomic strata, you have obviously the geographical spans, and, you know, in that time and space, you know, people, when they settled, they tended to settle. It wasn't like now where, you know, there's a job, or I'll jump out of the plane, or, you know, my wife or my girlfriend or significant others from here, but I'm from there. So there was a lot of trying to be as accurate as possible in terms of transposing what was already on the page, but then taking myself back. You know, this was, the time and place was between 1841 and 1853, so clearly that was out of my range, and I would try to read things that represented a little bit more of the common language. You know, if you read literature at that time, it was for people who read, and if you read a lot of plays, that was for people who tended to obviously go to the theater. But one thing that I found that was very, very helpful was newspapers, because they tended to be very region-specific, and even though the language might be elevated, they had to reach their readers. That was very, very important. And within that, the thing that I discovered that was really helpful was shipping news. Shipping news was great because that was that was basically your big sell to all the individuals. So in some regions, people would try to be very effusive and very flowery in their language to get you to buy and come in and do this. Other places, they're very straightforward. There was a lot of merchant traffic coming through, and they didn't have a lot of time for things. So early, for example, when you see the two individuals who kidnapped Solomon, and they were very flowery in their language, and they were trying to lure him. That dialogue was not exactly straight from shipping news, but it was in that language and in that style. And there are other places, when you get down to Freeman, for example, Paul Giamatti's character, and doing his hard sell, where I wanted to be more matter of fact. But yeah, that was just sort of finding my way into what are those artifacts that are going to help me be sort of a Rosetta Stone for everything else that was moving forward.
Thank you. Anything?
Talk about the coffee shop 20 years ago, what you're going to write. What got you to the coffee shop? Where were you before the coffee shop?
Well, I went to NYU, and I didn't study writing. My major was East Asian languages and culture, but I had come out to Los Angeles, and I mean, it's like anything else. You need to be around other people who are supportive, and you need to, generally you come out, you're sitting in a little apartment all day long. You got to get out. You got to be around people, and I think that's really helpful. A lot of writing is really listening, and listening to other people, and listening to how they speak, and watching them interact, and watching the social circles. I think that's a really big part of being a writer, is not just being in your head, no, I'm going to have this clever line, I'm going to put this down on the page, but, how are you sitting right now? How are you choosing to dress? When you talk, how do you put your language out there? How do you interact with other people? That I think is really a big thing. So to me, that early stages of going to the coffee shop, and in some ways it's become a bit of a cliche. In some ways, I think it's probably the most important place you can go. And where else are you going to go? You're not going to go in the early days. You're not going to go sit in a writer's room, because you can't. That's where you want to end up being. You can't. Maybe you got three other people living with you. You got to get away from those folks and be around some other different people. And it was very, it was energetic. It was very collegial. Everybody's aspiring, and that's great. Everybody has that energy. They're not beaten down, they're not worn out, they're not talking about, the things that happen with the exec, they're talking about what they want to do. And that was great, and I miss that. I really do, because I don't fit in that space anymore. I don't have the same people. I'm not a kid. I got responsibilities at home that I have to do, but, you ride by the coffee shop, sometimes you drive by and you're like, yeah, look at these people hanging out, and sometimes you drive by, God, look at these folks, they're hanging out. And that's what puts you there. I don't think I'll ever have an experience like that again. I miss it. I do.
One more. Yes.
Yeah, I was interested in what you were saying about your work with the editor of the film. Yeah. I'd never heard that really, of a script writer before the film is shot. Go sit down with the editor. Can you explain a little bit? Did you arrive with the script, have him read it, and you talk to him about what do you think about it? Where do you think you're going to cut, or can I go further in that?
No, part of it, again, it wasn't that we talked about anything really, really specific, like let's do this or let's do that. It was Joe Walker's the editor, and I knew I was getting ready to go off to do the film that I was going to direct, and I'd seen some other things that he'd done. In particular, he did this film, Michael Caine, called Harry Brown, which is just, again, it's funny you talk about these cop show kind of things. It's not a straight cop show, but it's, you look at it and then go, oh, it's Death Wish. I've seen Death Wish. It's not. And you look at a film like that and you go, I just need to talk to this individual. I need to get to know him. I want to know how he thinks and his approach. And going back to your question also about different spaces where I worked, in television and sitcom, a big part of, for writing, is understanding editing, is understanding cinematography. Not that I can do it, because I will never be a cinematographer, I will never be an editor, but understanding those phases of filmmaking. So for me, when Joe, he had read, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but because he had worked with the director so much, he'd been exposed to 12 years, and he was on board to do that, and I had asked him to read All Is By My Side. And he was here, and I wanted to meet him and talk to him, and talk to him about Harry Brown, and talk to him about choices that he made and the why of it all. So it wasn't even so much about let's sit and talk and figure out this film, because I think you can get ahead of yourself a little bit. Let's have you guys go off and shoot it and figure that out. But it was immensely helpful to me to just put a face with the work, to put a personality with the work. The same with Sean, and again, working in television, these folks week in and week out. And you get an opportunity to understand where they're coming from, and they get an opportunity to understand where you're coming from, and build up that shorthand So that to me was very, very helpful. And again, just knowing editors and knowing, you see things in a film and you go, why? It's great to be able to actually sit down with somebody and go, oh, why? Why did you do that? Whether you liked it or disliked it, it's great to really have an understanding of what they were trying to accomplish and achieve.
Well, John, I'd love to, thank you so much. I've loved this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. John Ridley, everyone.